So let's focus now on the new FAFSA. If you don't know yet, there are big, huge, gigantic changes coming to FAFSA here for this year's seniors. As I was talking before we got started here, my son is a senior this year. And part of my desire to do this webinar and to make sure that we did this in a timely fashion was I can't get over how many parents and students, how many seniors in particular and their parents, not just in the local high school, but in, any ones around where we live, and even friends that I know from college and elsewhere that live in other states, and so many of them just clueless about the fact that the FAFSA is undergoing a ginormous change, right? Not only in the timing, but in the substance and the number of questions and what's going to be counted and what's not going to be counted, and all of that sort of stuff is undergoing change. And so anybody who maybe has had students who've gone through this process in the past few years probably goes into it with an assumption that in a couple of weeks, you're going to be able to fill out FAFSA and everything's going to get started and get rolling. Nope, not happening this year, right? So because I felt like there was this lack of general understanding, I thought, well, I have an opportunity to share this with personal finance teachers. So let's make sure that you guys who are in the trenches working with students in high schools in particular know this and to have the opportunity to sort of make sure you know what we know right now, along with what we don't quite know yet, and know who to go to and where to go to continue to get good information. And so some of the most informed folks I know are at Penn State's Office of Student Aid. And so I didn't have to actually beg or plead. They were gracious enough to come and join us today. Jamie Kosh, a senior manager at Penn State Office of Student Aid, and we're joined as well by Craig Dietrich, who is student aid coordinator. Between the two of them, they have over a dozen years at Penn State's Office of Student Aid. Jamie has a couple dozen or almost another 2 dozen elsewhere. So lots of experience there. And Craig actually started his career as a math teacher. So time spent in the classroom, like many of you. So preeminent experts in this space. And I think, one of the reasons I think it's helpful to hear about this from Penn State in particular, well, one, it might be a place that many of your students are considering applying. But the implications for these changes to FAFSA are really far reaching. It is, this big change that's happening by, the US Department of Education that is going to have an end impact on, students and their families and, the timing, everything, and when and how they make their decisions around financial aid. But it's also having a huge impact on student aid offices around the country, as every college and university has to figure out how now to integrate the new system that they haven't seen yet necessarily with theirs and make all of this work for incoming students next year, and all of their students that they have right now. So without further ado, I would love to turn things over, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you guys can begin sharing yours. As always, as we go, I would welcome folks to pop into the chat with any questions that you have. Feel free to pose those there. I will continue to monitor that. I am battling a little bit of a bug, so I'm going to go off camera so that no one has to see here while I sneeze and go through a stack of tissues. So anyhow, I will be here in the background listening attentively, but they are all yours, Craig and Jamie. Thank you.
Thanks, Hillary. And welcome, everybody. And again, we're very grateful to be here tonight to share this information with you, and especially thankful that you're willing to take this information back to your students and families. Obviously, with all the big changes coming, anything that we can do to get that word out is going to be beneficial to all of us. So again, we appreciate your time tonight. All right, so we're going to talk about, obviously, all these changes that Hillary mentioned with this FAFSA simplification, or as what they call it, the better FAFSA, better future. If you spend any time on social media recently, you see that they keep advertising it as the FAFSA getting a glam up. Not quite sure exactly what that means, but we'll see. As Hillary said, she has a senior student. I have a freshman in college student this year, so I got to fill a FAFSA out last year and to get to fill it out again here in the springtime. So anxious as well to see what all the changes are and how it might impact aid for myself personally as well. All right, Jamie, you can go ahead and the next screen. Perfect. So here's going to be a little overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. And as mentioned numerous times, the 24-25 changes are quite drastic. So we'll start off with the first big change, and that is the number of questions on the FAFSA is going to be reduced from approximately 108 to about 36. So that's a reduction of about 2/3 or 66 and 2/3%. There's that former teacher coming out in me. The other big change is going to be the requirement this year to give permission to transfer your data from the IRS. It's actually a thing called the FADDX, which stands for Futures Act Direct Data Transfer. That is going to replace the data retrieval tool, or DRT, that was optionable in the past. Again, you are going to be required to give consent to transfer that data this year, and if you do not give that consent, your FAFSA actually will not be valid. You won't get an official FAFSA. Another big change, and this is something that we've been clamoring for many, many years, is they're changing the name of the expected family contribution, which is obviously a misnomer. Everybody sees that and hears that term and thinks this is how much money I'm expected to pay or contribute to college, but simply it really is just an index that determines what student aid you qualify for. And thankfully, they finally decided to make that change and change the name to SAI, or Student Aid Index. So some of the reasons for these big changes, or the hopefully benefits of it, is it's going to hopefully reduce the likelihood of verification, just because there's going to be, again, a lot fewer questions that are answered and also a lot more data that's going to be transferred. Now, that's the hope, but Jamie will talk about it some here later. And we think that there's probably still going to be a decent number of verification selections, and he'll speak on that here some a little bit. All right. So our agenda for tonight, we're going to cover basically 4 things. I'm going to cover a little bit about what has happened so far, and then I'll pass it over to Jamie to talk about what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future. And then we'll give some other important information and just kind of wrap things up at the end. All right. So what has happened? On June 17th of 2021, there was a repeal of the Selective Service Registration, the drug-related conviction, and the Subsidized Usage Loan Limit Restriction, or SULA, eligibility limitations. So for anybody who's not familiar with SULA, SULA stands for Subsidized Usage Limit Applies. And basically what it is the following. It would set a time limit for the amount of semesters or years that a student would be eligible for subsidized loans. So as an example, if your student would be in a 4-year program or an 8-semester bachelor's degree program, they would be able to earn the subsidized loans up to 150% of that amount. So basically up to 12 semesters or 6 years. If they went beyond that number of semesters or years, then they would no longer be eligible for the subsidized loans, regardless of whether they had actually reached their aggregate limits for the subsidized loans or not. So any loans that were originated before July 1st of 2021, the SULA is still going to be applicable and apply. For any loans that originated after that date, that one has been repealed, so it would not be eligible anymore. Okay, on October 1st of 2022, then they did officially remove the Selective Service Registration status and drug conviction related questions from the FAFSA. So those questions were no longer collected on the current 23-24 FAFSA. All right, next slide. So now it's time for me to pass things off to Jamie. Jamie is a wealth of information and knowledge, so he's going to share a lot of details here with you about what's going on now and what's happening in the future.
All right. Thanks, Craig. Thanks, everyone, for attending tonight. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for helping spread the word on the changes to the FAFSA that are happening for this year. So as Craig mentioned, as Hillary mentioned, this is a big change. We haven't had changes to the FAFSA for almost 40 years. To see what we're doing now, not only is the FAFSA form changing, but also the system that operates behind it. The central processing system is going away. They're implementing a brand new system to process the FAFSA form. A lot of people are saying, well, you don't have that information out yet. When are you going to do that? Honestly, we don't have a lot of information yet from the Department of Education. We don't expect to see that until sometime in December. We're hoping to get additional information before that to do testing and all those things that we need to do. And certainly, as Hillary said, we're not the only school. Penn State's not the only school in this. It's every school that uses the FAFSA for financial aid determination. We have a lot of big changes this year, with making it much easier, getting information back to us, and how that's going to process for these students is yet to be seen. So we're hoping to do more follow-ups as it gets closer to the release date of the FAFSA. As we get more information, certainly share that with Hillary to make sure that we keep everyone informed of what's happening. So some of the big things that happened as of July 1st, 2023, we had changes to our professional judgment. Professional judgment is really the authority that the Department of Education gives financial aid offices to help those students that don't fit in that very regular tight slot of filing a FAFSA form, pretty standard. So everything that fell under that umbrella before, including changes of income, you want to remember, we're still going to use, and we have been using prior tax year information. So for 23-24, we used 2021 federal tax information. So just say a family had a change of income in the tax year 2022 where their income was much lower, or they had a one-time payment of some sort, or maybe withdraw from IRS from their retirement, or something like that in 2021 that made their adjusted gross income and income higher than what it normally was. The Department of Education told us that schools can go in and look at information from the current tax year, from 2022, after they file their taxes. We could use that information if it would allow the students to gain more eligibility for financial aid. So we've been doing that. Penn State's been doing that. A number of schools have been doing that. That was a special circumstance. The other kind of special circumstances that we dealt with were dependency overrides. So students that were maybe in an abusive household, that were kicked out, that were homeless, those types of situations were also called under that umbrella special circumstances, because it's not something you can report on the FAFSA form. It has to be processed through the school. So what the Department of Education said, we're going to streamline that process. We're going to break it into two parts for you. So instead of just a special circumstance umbrella, we're going to have special circumstances, and then we're going to have unusual circumstances. So you can use that term. It's not as interchangeable as it was before. Special circumstances are going to be those changes of income. Anything that happened in that tax year that's not happening in the current tax year, we can review that for additional eligibility for the student. The new term, unusual circumstances, really refers to any situation that would make a student independent if they don't fit the criteria already on the FAFSA form. So if they're not 24, if they're not a veteran, if they're not weren't in active service, there's a number of things there that make students independent. Independent means that they don't need their parent tax information on the form. And basically, it gives them a little bit more eligibility for federal loans. So with that, they did break it out, so it's a little bit easier for us to manage and for everyone in the student aid office to kind of understand what's going on. Well, this student has a special circumstance, this student has an unusual circumstance. So we know there's dependency versus financing, whatever's going on with the tax information. So they made those provisions for us to use. Other things that are happening is that the Department of Education said all schools that receive federal funding now must do professional judgment. In the past, that wasn't the case. It was up to each school to determine their own professional judgment rules. And if they even wanted to do professional judgment, some schools said, we're not doing anything, whatever's on that FAFSA, we're going to use, no matter if there's changes or things like that, it'll catch up in the next year. We're not touching them. If a student's dependent or independent, as determined by the FAFSA form on that original FAFSA, we're not touching it. If they have other circumstances, they are what they are for that year. And as you can see now, that's changed. Every school that receives that now must do professional and execute professional judgment for students, and they must do it in a timely manner, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Those adjustments are special circumstances. We need to have information on our website to allow students to access that information. So we need to kind of guide the students in those situations. We need to post that on our website. We need to have that information readily available for students to look at. Would I fit my circumstances? I was in an abusive household. I did talk to my parents. Now I'm no longer in that household. can I appeal for special circumstances? And we're going to have guidelines. All the schools now are required to have guidelines to help students navigate that process. It can be very daunting. You as a school trying to make students relive those situations can be very exhausting, can be very detrimental to the student's mental health. And those are the kind of things that we're trying to navigate away from and help the students get through that situation as quickly as possible. The other thing that Department of Education said that we can also use dependency overrides as determined from other schools. In the past, if a student went to school A and was deemed independent there, and then they decided to transfer to school B would put them through that same process again. They may have different standards. They may not be even independent at school B. So what we're doing now is trying to streamline that process and make it kind of even for everyone across all the playing field. So if a student transfers, they don't have to go through that process again and relive that situation. The other thing that we're looking at, the adjustments for unusual circumstances, we have to offer that reasonable timeline, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So we could do that. So basically what that means is, in the past, some schools would get the information, they would request information from the student, and then they may sit on it for 2, 3, 4 months before getting the information back to the student. It is daunting for the school. There's a lot of moving parts when you're doing dependency overrides for those unusual circumstances. There's typically getting a team together and then passing it out to the team, and then making sure that you have everybody has the same information, or you may need to go out several times to that student for additional information. So it's very time consuming, but again, our goal is to get that information back to students as quickly as possible, especially for those students trying to make those decisions on where they want to go. What's my aid going to look like? Can I afford it? And is the school going to assist me in that? So going with that, those unusual circumstances, the process for unaccompanied youth and foster youth, orphans, ward of the court, and students with those unusual circumstances must be processed within 60 days once the information is complete from the student. So as I said, you could be going out several times to these students for information, but it's really to get the schools moving on that. And honestly, I'm very fortunate in the Office of Student Aid at Penn State. We get them done in about 2 weeks. It does take about that long. We wish it would go faster, but as I said, there's a lot of moving parts there. And the acceptable documentation that schools may request has also been changed. Before, we would go out for a lot of different third-party documents and things like that. Again, the Department of Education is trying to streamline that process. The other thing that is happening on July 1st is that happened on July 1st, the Pell Grant lifetime eligibility usage, the LEU was restored. So as Craig said, what happened with the federal subsidized direct loan, the Pell Grant eligibility usage has been restored at studentaid.gov. So students can go in and look at their eligibility. They know in real time what their usage was on federal Pell Grant. They have 12 semesters. And as Craig said with the SULA, there was confusion about a student going for an associate's degree and then going for a bachelor's degree, and how much did I use here and how much did I use there. Again, they're giving them the 12 full semesters of eligibility for federal Pell Grant before that would cut off. Okay. The other thing that we did when we're doing the special circumstance and unusual, specifically the unusual circumstances for 24-25, is we used to have 2 dependency statuses. So a student was either dependent or they were independent. So dependent means they couldn't answer any of those 13 questions, being over 24, active service, active military, those kind of things that would make a student independent by terms listed on the FAFSA form, by those questions. What they did now for 24-25 is a student may fall into one of those unusual categories, or more more documentation is needed, like our unaccompanied youth, our orphans, or wards of the court, where they have to provide the school, the institution that they're attending, additional documentation. So they're now in a pending status, kind of a limbo, before the FAFSA, the aid can be fully dispersed. So it's still going to give the student, if they're a provisional independent student, student, it will still give them an SAI, but it won't be confirmed until the school confirms it through the verification process. So it's nice that it's giving them. In the past, if a student marked they were an independent but not by the regular means on the FAFSA, they wouldn't get an EFC until they process that information. So we couldn't package them or anything. So it's really going to speed up the process for this year, where students can fill that out, get the information. Again, it's pending estimated until we get the full documentation, but at least we can move on and process aid for that student. Last but not least, they took the provisions, and the Department of Education took the provision that incarcerated students can now receive federal Pell Grant. In the past, they were ineligible for federal aid. So now students that are incarcerated can go back to school and receive federal Pell Grant to assist with their educational costs while they're incarcerated. So that's a big change. A number of schools and institutions are now starting programs for incarcerated students to help with that, and to assist in their higher education goals. Okay, a couple other things that changed as of July 1st. Really big changes to something called the cost of attendance. If you've been in aid, or you understand aid for a while, or you've heard it before, cost of attendance is really our budget that we set at higher education institutions, and it really limits the amount of aid that a student can receive. More or less, it limits the amount of loans they can borrow. If a student gets all grant money up until their full cost of attendance, they're doing great. That rarely happens, because in the cost of attendance, we're doing billable and non-billable costs. So our billable costs, tuition fees, room and board, are all in there. Anything that you see on the bill from the college or the institution would be part of that cost of attendance. But also, you're going to see on there transportation, books and supplies, those things that we can't really estimate what it's going to cost until the student has their schedule, or until they take action on that. What books they're going to buy, or basically any cost that it would be for a student to attend for one full academic year, fall and spring, to live on campus, if you would. So that's going to be toiletries, clothing, laundry, all those incidental things that we build in to kind of build a budget to allow a student to, again, get aid or borrow up into that, so that they can really focus on their studies. It's what we do it for. So along with those cost of attendance components, they made a lot of bigger changes to it on what can be included and what can't be included. So some of the things that we're changing is going to be what we're labeling this. So in the past, we used to say room and board. All the schools used to say room and board cost is this. Not a lot of students understand what board is. Okay, we get a lot of calls. Well, where's my meal plan? What's my meal plan going to be? How much do I have for that? Department of Education is saying all institutions that offer federal aid now need to list food and housing as that living expense. Not only do we have to list it, but we also have to add some more funding onto that, or increase the cost of attendance due to food insecurity. So no longer was it 2 meals a day, 1 meal on the weekend. We now need to account for 3 meals a day for students that live on and off campus. And then we could work it a little bit differently, usually at least 2 meals a day now for those commuting from home. So in the past, we really didn't have a room and board for commuter students. That's no longer true. We have to have a room and board component on there for even students that are commuting from home. There is a cost associated with that. Students could be paying rent, those kind of things. Basically, everything that we're talking about with cost of attendance, students could go in and appeal for an increase in their cost of attendance for study abroad, for unusual circumstances. Obviously, we tried to do our best to get an average of what our cost of attendance should be for all students, but not all students are from Pennsylvania, from Center County, from this, that, and the other thing. So we know students from out of state, it's going to cost more to travel to the university on breaks, all those things. So we do have the professional judgment to increase those things for students. But you're going to see for this year, we're really bolstering that cost of attendance due to food insecurity, housing issues, things like that. In the past, the Department of Education would tell all the institutions, if your cost of attendance is too high, they're going to punish you. Basically what they would do is increase your loan rates for your students. It could impact, how aid is processed. But now this year, 24-25, due to all the things happening with the economy, now they're saying you need to increase your cost of attendance to take into account to make sure students have food and housing, adequate money for those things. So we're seeing a lot of changes on that side, and you're going to see that increase across all institutions. The other thing they said we could do was license and certifications of the first professional credential that are issued for a one-time allowance. So if students are receiving a certification for their degree or a licensure, as long as they're enrolled when they apply and get that licensure or certification, we can increase that cost of attendance for them to include that amount. So if they're getting a professional license, veterinarian, law, whatever it may be, they can include that one-time cost in there. So that's nice for our professional students, graduate students. Typically undergraduates, there's a few programs, but really not as many. The other thing that you're going to see this year is our cost of attendance must be completely laid out for all students and families. So in the past, cost of attendance was really that thing in the behind. So you didn't really understand where it was coming from or how it was derived by the institution. Transparency is the key now. So they're having all institutions create a cost of attendance sheet that will be posted on their website. Anywhere that schools list the tuition and fees or any tuition on their website, it's going to link back to that cost of attendance page. So as you know, institutions have tuition calculators, housing calculators, things like that. Now we're going to actually show what that information is coming from, how much transportation is allotted. All those different categories are now going to be broken out so that students and families can do an apples to apples comparison from school to school. So we're excited about that. The other thing is additional expenses for incarcerated students. Again, whatever they're working with, if they need additional funds for be it transportation, from that institution or other fees that are associated, they can also build that into the cost of attendance. The one thing I do want to point out that I just found out not too long ago was in the past, we could include loan fees, federal direct loan fees in the cost of attendance. No longer the case. We're not allowed to include fees in the cost of attendance, which I think is that's another story, but we'll talk about that later. So as you can see, it's a give and take. There's some trade-off with what's being given and what's being taken away. So let's see here. Went the whole way up there. So that's where we are with the cost of attendance. So you're going to see some changes there and everything that works through. So as we talked about, as Craig advised on July 1st, half the questions. So a lot of questions are going away. We're using a lot more skip logic in the new FAFSA form. So some of the questions, like the dependency question, if you're over 24, the form already has the student put their date of birth on there. Why did they need to answer that in the past? So that logic's going to kick in and do those things. The other big thing that you're not going to see on the form is their housing, which is a big deal for the Office of Student Aid, because that's how we set budgets. We set for on-campus, off-campus, and commuter students. So now schools need to go a different way to get that information. We're using admissions, we're using surveys, we're using those things to make sure that we get the correct information for our students when they matriculate at the institution. The other thing that's coming in is, as Craig already mentioned, that data exchange. They're really bolstering that information on there. A couple things that we're really excited for are the number of situations that we can still retrieve information. So in the past, if there was a two parents, parent one and parent two, married but filing separately, filing independent on their own, we couldn't do that. The FAFSA wouldn't manage that because there was only one FSA ID on the form. Now the FSA ID, you can include two on the form and it can pull that information for both parents in. So it's really expanding eligibility for parents to use the data retrieval exchange that we're doing. So we're really excited about that. The other thing they're doing is the FSA ID can now be used for non-citizens. So if the student, if the parent is a non-citizen, if they're in the US or if they're in another country, they can still apply and use an FSA ID to sign the FAFSA form. Okay, which is a big deal for us. It's very important that we do that. Really speeds up the process. Electronically signing the form makes it, probably takes 4 weeks out of the process. So a lot of those things are happening. The eligibility, the way that it's going to be determined is going to be much different than the way it was in the past, obviously, with the SAI, going from that to the EFC that we were talking about. They're going to do different things. So we're talking about a number of questions coming off the FAFSA, a number of things that we're not really excited about. So the two that we're really looking at is they're removing the question about small businesses. Small businesses now will need to report all their asset information on the FAFSA form. So as you remember in the past, small businesses with under 100 employees didn't need to list asset information on the FAFSA form. They will be required to do that from 24-25 and further. The other one that we're not excited for in Pennsylvania especially are for farmers. Any farmer that had a farm that was part of their estate or their home, they didn't need to report any of that asset information on the FAFSA form. Now they will be required to do that for this year. So they're changing a lot of the way that funds are being calculated and how that's gonna play in. You've all seen the different repayment plans that we have through the Department of Education due to those direct loans for students that are borrowing the federal direct subsidized and unsubsidized, as well as the Parent Plus loans. So there's a lot of new income-driven repayment plans out there, and really trying to bolster that loan discharge, public service loan forgiveness, permanent disability, making it easier for students to apply and actually for it to work out for them. In the past, and I'm sure you've heard it, we've had students that would follow it to a T and then find out from a lender, oh, you missed this form, or you didn't do this on time, or something like that. And the Department of Education is really cracking down on that abuse by the loan servicers and the loan lenders. Okay, Craig said about the SAIs replacing that index. That will be the determination for eligibility for Title IV aid, federal Pell Grant, FSCOG, work study, federal direct loans. The SAI is now changing. So instead of an EFC, if you remember, from a 0 EFC to whatever number it would be, calculated by the income and asset information on the FAFSA, the new information, the SAI can go from negative 1,500 forward. So it's really going to magnify the highest need students that we have. And that's kind of the discussion we're having right now is, we went from a 0 EFC where we gave Pell Grant and work study and all those things. Now our negative, 1,500, how many students are we looking at that are going to fall into this highest need category? Are we going to have enough institutional aid to cover that? So we have a lot of things to discuss once we start getting ICER information, FAFSA information, but we won't know until that FAFSA comes out and we start seeing what students are actually filing with. Some of the calculations that we did from the early information that institutions were set at Penn State, specifically, we're seeing about a 4,000 student increase in federal Pell Grant eligibility on our returning students. So you can see that's going to be a lot of federal dollars that students are receiving that never received in the past. However, we have almost 1,000 students that are not going to qualify, that qualified for federal Pell Grant in the past. And the reason they're not going to qualify is due to one of the questions that was on there is the number in household. The FAFSA used to use number in household exclusively for, number in college exclusively for splitting up that EFC number. So as you remember, a family that had an EFC of 12,000, for example, if they had 2 in college, that would split that EFC in half. So one student would get an EFC of 6,000, the other student would get an EFC of 6,000. No longer the case. If the family's EFC is 12,000, it's going to be 12,000 for student 1 and 12,000 for student 2. So we're going to see that loss of eligibility, and I'm sure we're going to hear about that at the institutions. Again, as Hillary said, we're just the messengers. We're processing the aid and the FAFSA as it's giving to us from the Department of Education. So a lot of big changes this year. There's going to be some federal Pell proration. As you probably know, you could go out on about any website now and type in 2324 federal Pell Grant chart. And that would give you exactly what a student with an EFC listed on the top, and then the cost of the institution. If they were less than half-time, half-time, three-quarter time, and full-time, it would tell you exactly where they fall within a Pell range, just going off that EFC. No longer the case with the SAI. Department of Education is using number in the household. They're using the poverty guidelines now to determine eligibility for federal Pell Grant. So we're waiting to see what it's going to actually look like in our systems. So, but that's the way it's going to be determined. So, you could have two students very similar, but with different amounts of federal Pell Grant based on the number in household and things like that. So it's going to be very different. The other provision that was removed was the halftime status requirement for students attending in the summer. So a student coming for between their first year and second year could go in the summer, and if they qualified for federal Pell Grant in the past, they had to take at least 6 credits to get summer Pell Grant. They took that provision out. Now students between their first year and second year, third year, fourth year could attend and take even less than halftime credits and may even qualify for a small federal Pell Grant. So there are some big changes happening on how aid is being processed. Okay, some of the big things that you really need to, we really want you to take with you tonight is that all students must file the new FAFSA for 24-25. There's no renewal this year. Okay, so any returning students to universities must go in and complete a brand new FAFSA. Because it is brand new, the whole system is changing. Every student needs to do a new FAFSA form when it comes out in December. We're really telling students to go on after January 1st and apply. Give it some time to work out the bugs that are happening. We're sure there's going to be some complications. We're also sure, with the Department of Education, their servers are going to be overwhelmed once this form hits the streets. Not only are students going to go in and take a look at it, but institutions themselves are going to be kind of, really digging for that information. This is a one-year blip. So, 24-25 is that 1 year where there is a difference. So we know the FAFSA is going to come out in December. We're hoping still as an institution to get the aid packages out, end of February, early March, and then resume with kind of normal things for returning students. Remember, for 25, 26 and forward, we're going back to the release date of October 1st for the FAFSA form. I did say this before in my presentation. I just want to let everyone know that it does matter when students file the FAFSA form. Even though we say, you don't have to file until this deadline or December or whatever it would be. A lot of schools, especially the big schools, process aid in the order that the FAFSA was received. The students that apply earliest, closest to October 1st, or in this case, whenever that releases in December, are going to be awarded first. We award in the order that we received their FAFSA forms. So I highly encourage everyone to apply every year, to have students apply every year as close to that opening date as possible. Okay. As I mentioned, we should go back to normal after that, October 1st. And then even then, they're talking about making it even earlier than that, just to get those aid packages out to students to get them on the street as early as possible. So like I said, this is that 1 year blip, goes back to normal next year, and then we'll see where it goes from there. Okay. I'll throw it back to Craig.
All right, thanks, Jamie. Just a couple quick things here. I did put a couple of links in the chat for you. One is our student aid website for the Office of Student Aid. If you go out there, there's lots of good information out there. And you can also follow us on one of our social media pages, and we post outside information and updates on those pages for you. So good resources for you in case you want to keep up with things as we get the information, we put it out there. Also, there was a link to the student aid estimator that's actually live here recently. So families can go out there and use that estimator in about 10 or 15 minutes, get an idea of what type of aid they might be expecting to get for the 24-25 year. So feel free to use that. And one last thing, I want to go back and just revisit for a minute the special circumstances that we talked about a while ago. Those are the changes in income. Keep in mind that for the 23-24 year, we're using 21 tax information. So a family very well could experience, a change in income for 22 or even the current tax year. So that's what that special circumstance is for. Okay, but every school has their own policies, pertaining to that. So what might be considered a special circumstance at one school may not be at another. So it happens pretty frequently where we have families call us where one student is attending another institution and they were able to process a special circumstance. They call Penn State and we can't, or vice versa. So just something to be aware of, when you're having those conversations with, your families and students. So all right, just a couple things here to conclude on, and then we'll see if we have any questions here to kind of wrap up. So the purpose, I guess, the main goal of this whole thing is to try to streamline this application process. Again, 36 questions instead of 108 sounds pretty good to me. So hopefully we'll see how it goes here in a few months. Expanded federal aid eligibility should be a result of this. We do know from those questions, like the number in college not being included anymore, that there could be a small percentage of people that do lose some eligibility, but unfortunately, that's going to happen. The good news is we've run some simulations here recently to find out how many students we would think would qualify for things like the federal Pell Grant this year if we used the new information. And we did see a pretty significant increase in the number of students that were eligible. So even though, again, we might have some that lose that eligibility, there should be a good number more that do gain some eligibility. So we think it's going to be a positive moving forward. Again, hoping to try to reduce some of those barriers for some of those students that we talked about, streamline things, make it a little bit easier for them, and overall just make it a better user experience for all of us that have to deal with this thing every year. All right, that's all that we have to present here for tonight. So we'll see if anybody has any questions for us. You can go ahead and move on to the next screen there, Jamie. Again, we thank you for your time this evening, and again, appreciate the opportunity to be here. And hope you found some good information for this evening.
Thank you both. That was fantastic. I'm going to let you guys leave that resources slide there and open up the chat here for any questions that our participants might have. I know I was taking a variety of notes both this afternoon and this evening, and I was thinking, okay, so any of my my lessons or materials, I'm going to need to make sure that I update anything that references to the EFC to now talk about the Student Aid Index. Obviously going to have to rethink the timing for this year, but in hopes that next year it'll go back to October, but again, we'll wait and see. I'm going to need to make sure that any references to room and board, although I guess some schools might still call it room and board. So we probably for right now, for teaching purposes, still need to call it room and board, but make sure they know that means food and housing. And isn't it awesome that we're going to actually use plain real language that people will understand on this? Because how many times have we had to explain that board means food, right? That's not something that most high schoolers and certainly parents that have never, been to college themselves would understand. So lots of different things there. This timing is a big deal. So FIA, for example, isn't even scheduling any of their FAFSA completion activities until January at the very earliest. So, we know that this is something that's going to be a while in coming. I was reminded recently, however, that, this is the timing that it used to be, right? So like it used to be that the FAFSA was open in January, and yes, everybody still was able to make their decisions and do everything, by the 1st of May or what have you. But we've been kind of spoiled for a number of years here with having everything available in October. So, for those students who it's their very first, first one in the family, for example, this isn't necessarily going to be a change. This is just going to be how it is, although perhaps a little bit of a bumpy ride this year. But in particular, for families that have gone through the old version of the FAFSA with older students, I imagine it's probably going to be sort of even a bigger eye-opening, experience for them, really getting to see that things have changed. So, I'd encourage everybody that's on with us today to definitely have some conversations. Make sure that your guidance counselors or school counselors are really plugged in about these changes, and have these conversations with your students, in particular, and how it's going to impact sort of their timeline, right? And what you can do in advance, because in the past, we sort of knew what all those questions were going to be. We could have students, figure all of these things out and sort of have everything ready, know how to answer all of those, so that when things went live, they were ready to go, right? Especially, to Jamie's point, aid most schools, it's kind of a first come, first serve. And if you don't get in there right at the get-go, you're missing out. So it is a little bit of a challenge this year, because we don't have yet everything that in an easily packaged, sort of way to know what those, was it 36 questions? Did I get that right, Craig? On the
Yep.
new, so a little bit different, and obviously making sure that everything syncs up with their taxes and what have you. So this is definitely a big deal. And then certainly those changes that you guys talked about, the farm families, big change for, especially for families that have been through this process before, that might not have had to count those assets and what have you, and all of a sudden they're going to. Same thing with those families with a parent that has a small business. And as you guys mentioned, this isn't just impacting this year's, seniors. Everybody that's in school is going to have to refile again with this new form. So my suggestion to all of you, I know some of you in particular on here maintain contact with some of your former students. Think about making sure that you're touching base with those that you do, especially some of those maybe that you held hands through this process in the past. Maybe think about reaching out to some of them if they might need a little hand holding again, or certainly encourage them to get in touch with their school's Office of Financial Aid or Student Aid, like the folks at Penn State, because I'm sure there'll be somebody there that's willing to help them when this time comes. So thank you again, gentlemen. It was a pleasure to have you on with us. I appreciate the time that you spent with us, and I'm so glad that our participants were able to learn from such knowledgeable individuals. It really means the world to us that we could have you here with us this evening. I'm going to turn it over to my screen now here for just a second. All righty. So you guys should be seeing my screen now. If you can't, please let me know. Okay, good. I'm getting nodding heads. I always love it when there's somebody else on, since everybody's on webinar format. But so thank you once again. And just a reminder, we do have those upcoming webinars as well as the in-person events that you guys can sign up for, and I'd encourage you to do so. But other than that, thank you so much for participating in this evening's webinar. Hope that we will see you on one in the future. I know you guys have a lot of other things that you could be doing on a nice Thursday evening, but I appreciate you choosing to spend it with us.